struggle was not red. I experienced it, being deprived, being oppressed, even confused. It's enough now, we're taking the power back. We're stronger than before, we're proud and too strong. The worst is over. From Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar. From Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the AZAPO online political education series. And today I'm hosting Dr. Phetho Mangena. We are discussing the COVID-19, post-COVID-19 implications. As some of you may know, Dr. Mangena is a trained and registered specialist physician and a nephrologist, and he is currently the head of internal medicine at Pietersburg Hospital, and is also working as a senior lecturer with the University of Limpopo's School of Medicine. And he has spent the last couple of months working on the COVID-19 situation, leading a team of specialists looking at clinical issues related to COVID-19 at Pietersburg Hospital. And welcome, Dr. Mangena, and it's great to host you on this platform.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, we have spent a bit of time a couple of months ago discussing COVID-19 and looking at the economics and politics of COVID-19. And we had Professor Mondentwasa taking us through, the evolution of COVID-19 pandemic and where we at as the country and the continent and the world in dealing with issues pertaining to this virus that has afflicted not only the nation but the world. It would be great to hear from you, where to from here and what we have been doing, with regard to fighting this pandemic and what the world has been doing and what has been happening in the continent of Africa. And just looking at the implications of this pandemic and post-COVID, what kind of society we're going to have and how we're going to continue to live with this pandemic, going forward. And so I look forward to, hearing from you what your thoughts and views and ideas are. And, the floor is yours to share your thoughts with us.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I hope my screen is now visible.
I can see your screen, thank you.
Okay, all right, so once again, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this session, and thank you to the audience that is tuning in on the various platforms that are being provided to beam a stream of this discussion that we shall have with yourself, Simpiwe.
Yes.
So I think all of us are more than aware how COVID-19 has impacted our daily lives. In the space of less than a year, in about 10 months, this disease has raced across the world. And in its wake, it's left a huge toll. For a start, there are now more than 1 million known deaths that can be attributed to this illness. Potentially lots more, which have not been laboratory confirmed cases. We've also seen health services throughout the world being overwhelmed, including some of the best resourced countries on the planet. And we've also seen economic ruin. Once again, this is throughout the world, including in some of the most richest and most developed countries, have also struggled with the economic fallout that follows this pandemic. Not to mention the true human cost. We can't always put a number to it, but the societal upheaval that we've seen. That includes children who've had their education disrupted, all sorts of familial bonds which were unable to maintain due to movement restrictions, as well as the huge psychological cost on many vulnerable people, such as older people who are very dependent on their social networks to give them a sense of normalcy. All that is part of the huge toll that COVID-19 has wrought upon the entire population of the world. And important to say, despite the talk being titled the post-COVID implications, we're still in the middle of the storm with no idea yet when the storm will abate. Amongst other things, the pandemic has dominated all aspects of our lives, including whether we work, whether we earn, and if we do, whether people earn their full salary or whether people earn a percentage of their salary for those who are lucky enough to still be in employment and still receiving a salary. It also dominates all our media feeds, whether that is traditional media or our social media feeds, and is also the key topic in our daily conversation in all spheres. And constantly we hear people talking about how our world has changed forever and will never be the same again. And these are some of the things I'll touch on as to whether there really will be long-lasting changes that we can expect in the world. So before we really talk about the post-COVID situation, it's useful, of course, to talk about how we got here to where we are in October 2020. So where did we come from to get to this position, and where are we likely to go to moving forward? Now, because we're dealing with a virus, it's useful to at least start by describing a little bit what is this foe that we call the SARS coronavirus 2, which is the virus that has been implicated as the cause of this pandemic. So a starting point is, of course, to define what a virus is. Now, viruses are very unique organisms. Firstly, they cannot survive without another cell, and to survive with another cell, they have to introduce themselves into that cell, and then they use the machinery of the cell that is infected to produce more copies of themselves. Viruses really follow one simple rule in life, which is infect as many cells as possible, produce as many copies of yourself as possible, and then move on to the next infection, and then the next infection, and the next infection. They really have their priorities sorted out straight. The virus itself consists of a small strand of genetic material, which can be RNA or DNA, which is covered by a layer made up of lipid or fat. Now, the relevance of the virus being wrapped in an envelope or a layer of fat is that this fat can be easily broken down with simple soap and water. Now, this explains why one of the key instructions to individuals to help avoid infection with the coronavirus is frequent hand washing and hand sanitization. Because simply put, the soap and water or the alcohol-based sanitizers break down the lipid layer or the fat layer that makes up the outside of the virus, and therefore it destroys it very easily. Now, this particular virus seems to have an affinity for the respiratory tract in that it enters the body through parts of the respiratory tract. However, once it's within the body, it is able to move to different parts of the body and can cause various disease manifestations. Now, the coronaviruses themselves are only one family out of the thousands and millions of families of viruses. There are two coronaviruses that we've encountered before that have caused illness on this scale. The first was what we now call the first SARS epidemic, or the severe acute respiratory syndrome. Now, this was a virus caused by one of the coronavirus family members and predominantly affected people in Southeast Asia. And then the second was the Middle East respiratory syndrome, or MERS, which also caused a severe respiratory illness with a high mortality, which was largely limited to only the Middle East. Now, in common with all coronaviruses, for these viruses to enter into humans, they first have to go through a series of what we call intermediary hosts, which is an animal through which the virus can replicate in. And importantly, whilst replicating in this animal, the virus picks up adaptations which make it suitable now to infect human beings. I've already mentioned the two major viruses, that is SARS coronavirus and the MERS coronavirus. There are, however, 4 other coronaviruses which most of us have probably been infected with at some point in our lives, because these are viruses that cause the common cold, and they're actually the second leading cause of the common cold. So it's quite probable that at any time in the past, if any of you had to spend a day at home with the snuffles and complained about having the flu, we probably had an infection which is very likely to have been caused by one of these coronaviruses. This table just once again shows the 3 more deadly coronaviruses, that is the first SARS coronavirus and the Middle East respiratory coronavirus. The first SARS coronavirus first emerged in 2003 in China, and it's thought that this virus, the intermediate host was the bat. And this virus had a mortality rate of about 9%. Then the Middle East respiratory virus came on about 10 years later in 2013. Fortunately, for whatever reason, it was limited strictly to Saudi Arabia and parts of the Middle East. And I say fortunate because this virus in turn had a much higher mortality of up to 35%. And then, of course, currently we're dealing with the second SARS coronavirus, and it's speculated to have a case fatality or a mortality rate of 2%. What this means in simple terms is 2% of people who are known to have the infection will die from this infection. Now, one of the interesting things that a lot of virologists seem to talk a lot about is how these viral infections seem to come on every 10 years. If you look at the interval between the first SARS outbreak in 2003 and the second one in 2013, you're looking at a 10-year gap. And then between the Middle East respiratory virus and the SARS coronavirus, we're looking at a 6 to 7 year gap. So interesting enough, virologists are speculating that in the next decade, we're likely to have another coronavirus outbreak. So that's food for thought, and that's one thing we'll touch on later when talking about life post-COVID. Now, when we talk about respiratory viruses in terms of how they are transmitted, typically they are transmitted in the secretions that come from the respiratory tract. Now, these secretions just means these blobs of mucus. Now, these blobs of mucus are expelled when people talk, when they laugh, when they sing, when they shout, when they cough, or when they sneeze. And there are really 2 types of droplets, of these droplets. There are these large droplets, which are typically so heavy that they fall to the ground very quickly. Now, a good example is if you think of an apple tree. If you shake an apple tree, those apples are going to fall straight down to the ground because they are so heavy. They're not going to float around in the air. A different kind of transmission is through aerosols. Now, aerosols are much smaller secretion droplets. Now, as opposed to the larger droplets, aerosols can actually float in the air, and therefore they can remain within a room or any environment for longer periods of time, and therefore they tend to be more infectious. Now, early on in the pandemic, the World Health Organization was adamant that the SARS-CoV-2 can only be spread by droplets, that is the much larger droplets that fall to the ground very quickly, as opposed to aerosols. Now, it's important to understand why there was a big controversy around this. The first is, if aerosols is a key determinant of transmission, then it changes everything that we tell healthcare workers as well as the general public about how to protect themselves. For a start, they have to wear different kinds of masks. And early on in the pandemic, there were issues with regards to availability of the N95 type mask, which is a mask typically used only in healthcare settings, and is a mask which specifically stops these smaller droplets, that is the aerosols. Now, with the larger droplets, when they fall to the ground, they also fall on other surfaces that individuals can touch. So if I am infected with SARS-CoV-2 and I am coughing or sneezing in a room, those droplets will fall to the ground within 2 meters of where I am. And they fall on surfaces such as tables, as well as doorknobs, chairs, and the like. And anyone else who uses that room will, in the course of any activity that they're conducting through that room, will touch these surfaces. They touch the tables, they touch the doorknobs and the chairs. And because most individuals are estimated to touch their faces at least 10 times a minute, in very quickly, we transfer infectious particles from these surfaces around us towards the face, that is the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, from which the virus can then find a way into infecting the individual. I mentioned that these droplets fall to the ground very quickly within 2 meters because they're so heavy. This is the basis for the social distancing requirement that we should remain at least 1.5 meters away from each other. Up to now, the state of science is that whilst aerosol generation is possible, it is unlikely to be a major route of infection. And one of the reasons that we can surmise it's not a major route for infection is that in many circumstances where individuals are known to be infectious and are coughing on other people, the infection does not spread quite as rapidly as one would expect if infection was entirely aerosol driven. So the implication simply is, for us to keep ourselves safe from this virus, we need to continue maintaining some sort of physical distance to individuals around us where possible, and we need to continue with proper hand washing and hand sanitization, as that destroys the virus which may be on our hands from any surface that we may have inadvertently or deliberately touched. Now, the clinical features of the disease, it's taken us a few months to get a full grasp of all aspects of the disease. Now, we know that there are respiratory features such as a cough and sore throat. An interesting feature which was described with the SARS-CoV-2 virus was the loss of smell and loss of taste. And many individuals have picked that up as their only symptom of COVID-19. The disease has also been shown to cause gastrointestinal symptoms, in particular diarrhea. But the real game changer is that an unknown percentage, but possibly as high as 50% of people who are infected with the virus are actually asymptomatic. Now, this is important because if people are asymptomatic, firstly, they do not seek medical care. Secondly, they are unlikely to confine themselves to their home or to a particular room within their home because they simply feel they feel well. And this accelerates the spread of the disease because so many people are asymptomatic and they're sitting next to us on trains and buses. They're sitting next to us in our workplaces or even in our homes as well. One family member can be infected with the virus, come home, spend time with us, and when they leave behind a legacy of infection that we're unable to pick up because they were not infectious. Some of the complications from this disease, and these are mostly things that develop in patients who are sick enough to be hospitalized, particularly those who are sick enough to be in an intensive care setting. The commonest is the acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS, which simply means the lungs are full of fluid and they're unable to assist in breathing and the absorption of oxygen into the blood. These are then patients who require assisted breathing through a ventilator machine and all sorts of mechanical assistance with a very high mortality. Patients can also develop liver failure as well as kidney failure, strokes, and increasingly we're recognizing that they can develop venous clots, such as clots in the legs as well as clots in the brain and other organs. One concern which is emerging over the last few months is long-term complications, what is now termed long COVID-19. Now, at the beginning of the illness, we thought this was simply an acute respiratory illness where patients would have a pneumonia-like illness for up to 2 to 3 weeks, and then a small proportion would die, but most people would recover and rapidly return to normal. However, was beginning to recognize that some patients have got symptoms which persist for weeks and even months after the initial diagnosis of the infection. And individuals have been reported to have challenges with memory as well as ability to concentrate, and some just report this generalized fatigue which seems to last for months and months and months. So firstly, how did we get here in terms of a timeline of this disease? Now, the first external announcement was on the 31st of December 2019, when local authorities in China reported on a cluster of viral pneumonia of unknown cause. Now, partly because this was over the festive season, and also because it was downplayed by some authorities, the message did not quite get around the world, with the possible exception of Taiwan, where they quickly recognized that a viral pneumonia of unknown cause was a big alarm bell. Just over a week later, on the 9th of January, the Chinese authorities had actually isolated the virus which caused this viral pneumonia of unknown cause, and they'd been able to determine that it was from the family of coronaviruses. And on the 11th of January, the genetic sequence of this virus was released. And on the same day, the first known death from the novel coronavirus was reported in China. Now, it's important to highlight the speed with which the virus was identified and the genetic sequence was also released. It's quite unusual and it's quite groundbreaking in the scientific world to have released the genetic sequence of a previously unknown virus in less than 2 weeks after the initial isolation or the initial detection of an outbreak of this illness. It's also worth pointing out that later on, scientists were able to go back to tissue banks where they keep samples from patients who had been treated in the months earlier with unknown infections, and retested some of those samples. And in one sample, they found evidence that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was already circulating in France in October 2019. So this means this illness had somehow already escaped out of China in late 2019, even before the authorities had identified this initial cluster. On the 19th of January, the WHO acknowledged the possibility rather than the definitiveness of human-to-human transmission. And once again, this is a key thing. Once an infection is able to spread from one human to another, then the potential for a worldwide pandemic rises significantly. On the 11th of February, the disease was formally named coronavirus 2019, which shorthand is referred to as COVID-19. And on the 7th of March 2020, the WHO confirmed that there had now been a cumulative 100,000 patients worldwide, including patients in all the WHO regions, in other words, in all the continents. A few days later, on the 11th of March, the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic, which is a step they usually take to highlight the gravity of the outbreak, and is a step taken to marshal resources and to marshal collaborations to deal with the pandemic. Just a month later, from the first 100,000 cases, on the 4th of April, already there were 1 million confirmed cases, And on the 16th of June 2020, we had the first bit of good news was when a trial done in the UK showed that corticosteroids could reduce mortality quite significantly in some groups of patients with COVID-19. And this is the situation report from just yesterday from the World Health Organization. So as of yesterday, there have been just under 40 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 around the world, with more than 1 million deaths which have been attributed to this infection. So this is quite significant. Now, if we're to zoom in only on Africa and not look at the wider world, one of the surprises with the COVID-19 outbreak is how well Africa has fared compared to the rest of the world, with the possible explanation of our own country. Now, South Africa now has more than 700,000 cases, but if you look at other countries, the caseloads are very limited. Here, I've only listed the 3 African countries with the largest populations. So Nigeria has a population of 210 million or thereabouts, and they've had only 61,000 cases. Ethiopia has a population of over 100 million, and they've had only 87,000 cases. The DRC, with a population of 80-something million, has had only 10,000 cases. It's thought that South Africa is an outlier because the disease was probably introduced a lot earlier than the rest of the continent. Now, typically we tend to think the first South African infection was the individual who was identified as having flown from Italy and was diagnosed by his general practitioner as having COVID. However, new epidemiological data seems to suggest that sometime in late 2019, that is November and December 2019, as well as January and February 2020, infections were being introduced at multiple times into the South African population because we are a common holiday destination for many countries, especially around that time of the year. Other reasons why the rest of the continent has done well include the younger population across the province, across the continent rather, in that Africa has got, amongst all world regions, the youngest population with a median age of 18 years. And it's been shown repeatedly that this is a disease which frequently hits the elderly, and the highest mortality remains in individuals over the ages of 60 to 65 years. There's also speculation that the warmer temperatures in Africa, as well as the higher humidities, may also contribute to lower disease transmission of the illness. So this was work from a group in Saudi Arabia where they showed that when the temperature was higher, as you can see in West Africa, their average temperatures range around 31 degrees. That is in the middle months of this year. And they had low daily cases compared to Southern Africa, which was experiencing winter through much of the middle months of this year, with average temperatures of around 18 degrees Celsius. And it's reflected in a daily case load, which is more than 20 times higher than what they were experiencing in Western Africa and Central Africa. A different analysis looked at the daily cases and the daily deaths, comparing the 10 countries with the highest temperature and the 10 countries with the lowest temperature. So countries with the highest temperature include a lot of the Middle Eastern countries such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, as well as some African countries such as Ghana, whereas countries with the coldest temperatures include a lot of the Nordic countries like Sweden and Norway, as well as the Russian Federation, Canada, and the United States. And it's interesting how countries which have got a higher average temperature or lower humidity have got both a lower caseload and a lower mortality. So this gives credence to the theory that the climatic conditions themselves have played a role in transmission dynamics on the African continent. Other reasons that have been advanced include the underdeveloped transport networks between countries, but also within some countries, which simply means that it's a lot harder to travel from one side of the country to another in many countries. And as a result, it's a lot harder for the infection to spread, because it's worth remembering the infection always spreads with people rather than through the air or the like. There's been some speculation that individuals in the continent have got some form of cross immunity due to the high prevalence of other infectious agents. I will, however, indicate that there's not a lot of evidence for this for this theory. And the last one, which is something I think a lot of African countries have not received a lot of credit for, is that a lot of African countries actually closed down their borders and closed down their societies quite early in comparison to some of their Western counterparts. So for instance, a country like Kenya closed their borders when the first case was diagnosed. They did not wait for 10 cases, 100 cases, or 1,000 cases. As soon as they knew that COVID was in Kenya, they immediately closed the airports and closed the land borders. In comparison, South Africa, although we've had the narrative that our lockdown was quite early and therefore very efficacious, which is partly true, our lockdown only really started when we were close to 1,000 cases into our epidemic. And there's some statistical and epidemiological data to suggest that the horse had already bolted by that stage, which is why, amongst other things, the highest transmission of the virus was actually during the most stringent levels of lockdown. I don't know how many people took note that the highest rates of transmission were during levels 1, 2, and 3, and not during sorry, it's the other way around, during levels 5, 4, and 3, as opposed to levels 1 and 2. So in simple terms, a lot of countries were not given the credit that they acted timeously. They prioritize people over economies. And that is reflected in the lower caseloads that a lot of African countries can boast about at this point. Now, one of the things we need to be mindful about is there's the threat of the second wave. Now, if we look at a lot of the northern countries, and importantly, these countries saw the worst of the COVID outbreak some 2 to 3 months before a lot of African countries. In a lot of these countries, they are beginning to see a second wave. Now, this graph could be for quite a lot of different countries in the West, particularly in Europe. This one relates specifically only to London in the United Kingdom. But what you can see is that their cases peaked in middle of April, and then the cases seemed to plateau for a good 2 months to 2.5 months, and now they are experiencing a second wave. And one of the things about the second wave is, in many instances, it seems to be a lot more pronounced in that it affects a lot more individuals than the first wave. Fortunately, the mortality has been lower for a number of reasons. In general, healthcare systems are now attuned to dealing with COVID, and preparations have been made, including provision of appropriate beds, staff have been appropriately trained, and protective personal equipment is now available in appropriate quantities. However, the lockdowns, which in the last 2 weeks, lockdowns have been returning to many European countries. These lockdowns remain economically and socially disruptive in much the same way as the first set of lockdowns has been. Now, a common question being asked is, why all this fuss about COVID-19? Now, the first thing is, some people would say, surely this illness is no worse than the seasonal flu. Now, to start off with, this is way worse than the seasonal flu, in that the death toll from COVID in just the last few months, in about 9 to 10 months, has been double the estimated annual death toll from the flu. And this is with all the movement restrictions that the entire planet has had. One only has to imagine what would have happened if there had been no movement restrictions or lockdown in significant parts of the globe. The death toll would largely have, one can extrapolate that the death toll and the infection rate would have been many multiples higher than the data I showed you earlier. Now, we know for a fact that many illnesses kill far more people annually, but fewer get the attention that COVID-19 gets. So for example, in South Africa, I think we have somewhere in the order of 40,000 deaths due to tuberculosis every year. And no one asks for a lockdown to get a grip on tuberculosis. We have lots of deaths due to heart disease and strokes and the like, but once again, there are no movement restrictions for some of these illnesses. There are a couple of reasons why there's this international panic and the fuss and all these extreme measures that a lot of us have never lived through a curfew. And one of the reasons is, firstly, this is a disease that affects the entire population, which means the entire world population, irrespective of socioeconomic status or country of origin. And so what that has meant is that the entire world is focused on this one particular issue. Secondly, there's actually the prospect for many deaths within a short space of time. In other words, the COVID-19 pandemic poses an existential threat to many societies. Some of us will remember the pictures that we saw from Italy of hospitals completely overwhelmed with no space for new patients. The fridges, the refrigerated trucks, which were used as emergency mortuary space in New York, one of the richest districts in the world. They ran out of mortuary space and they had to hire these refrigerated trucks, which normally transport meat or other refrigerated goods, to store corpses simply because they were overwhelmed. And it was simply, it only takes a few leaps of imagination to try to imagine that situation being replicated in every city, every town throughout the world. The death toll could easily have been in the hundreds of millions, possibly heading into the billions. Now, one thing to note is because of the early action in many parts of the world, we actually don't know what the worst is in terms of COVID. In other words, no one can tell us that if we had not started with lockdowns, border closures, school closures, no one can actually tell us what that situation looks like. So we have nothing to compare it to. The only thing we have to compare to are these extrapolations from what we saw in China and to some extent what we saw in Italy, because they were the first hard-hit country in the world. We can only speculate that if the same rate of infection, same rates of death had been replicated throughout the world, that gives us the imaginary baseline that all authorities, all healthcare workers are trying to move us away from. And I think that's the simple answer as to why the fuss. It really was in your face with the potential to be with the potential to develop into devastation within a short space of time, the likes of which we've probably never seen before. Because even the first Spanish flu in 1918 took about 2 to 3 years to circulate throughout the world. And even then, because transport networks were not that well developed, some parts of the world still had relative sparing. Whereas the modern world, with its extreme interconnectedness, we were always likely that if this illness seeded itself throughout the world with little in the way of mitigation or suppression measures, then we would be counting a very heavy cost. And so my personal opinion is it was all justified. There are aspects of some of the measures that are open to debate, but at a simplistic level, something had to be done because the early data, the limited early data really did suggest that we're dealing with a true existential crisis to the entire global population. So I'm going to move a little bit away from what would be usually my area of comfort, which is simply discussing medicine, discussing drugs and how drugs interact and so on, and talk more about the socio-political implications of COVID and how these will pan out in the months and possibly the years that follow. Now, first of all, a medical historian has written that when we look at the life cycle or the natural history of an epidemic, they unfold in 3 acts. And these 3 acts, or the 3 phases rather, of the epidemic's life cycle start off with ignorance and then move on to recognition, and finally there's resolution. So ignorance is the phase when there's the first hints that something is going on. Now, this could be a doctor in a particular hospital picks up that, why in the last 2 weeks have we had 10 people come in with the same type of pneumonia? They don't seem to respond to the usual treatment, but they have this similarity and it's nothing I've heard about. So there are those initial reports. As I indicated, there was that first report in China on the 31st of December from a local authority that they had a cluster of infection. And the only people who seemed to really jump on this information were the Taiwanese, because in their minds, the nation's mind, the SARS epidemic of 2013 to 2015 was still fresh in their minds. Not to mention that the leader of Taiwan is actually an epidemiologist by training. So this was probably someone with experience with the first SARS. And as soon as they heard that there was another virus of unknown origin, they quickly ramped up all sorts of public health interventions and hence were able to quickly contain this infection. So after the phase of ignorance, when it takes time before the full picture emerges and then society really gets a grip that we have something to deal with, then there's the phase of recognition. Now, in recognition, firstly, there are attempts by individuals to try to explain what's going on. Some of these explanations are unfortunately prejudicial. Now, if you remember when HIV came about, the first thing people said was, well, it's the gay people. Some people said it's the African people, and so on and so forth. So same thing with COVID. Initially, people thought, let's blame the Chinese. So let's call it the Kung Fu virus or other derogatory names. But parallel to attempts to explain, there's also attempts to reassure, which may not always be grounded in reality. So people will tell us, don't worry, this virus is in China. How is it going to get to the southern tip of Africa? Or this virus seems to only affect lighter skinned people. So if you're dark skinned, you should feel protected. I'm sure some of you still remember those messages earlier on. And as soon as there's recognition that something is happening, the public responds. Now, the public can respond through institutions. So we have, for instance, the National Institutes for Communicable Disease, the NICD, ramping up their testing platforms. We have training of healthcare workers to deal with the pandemic. And then we have all sorts of infrastructure projects. Do we need to build a new hospital? Do we need to order oxygen tanks? Do we need to order protective personal equipment, PPE, or the like? And the final phase is resolution. Now, an epidemic resolves itself in 2 ways. The one is because there's some societal action which clamps down on it. Now, this could mean the combined medical research capabilities of a nation, or in this instance, on a multinational front, is able to then produce a workable solution, a vaccine or a cure. But it can also mean that the epidemic simply burns out. Now, this happens with viruses where it affects all the susceptible people people who are likely to get the infection and die from it. And the only people left are people who are somehow immune or less susceptible, or people who have been infected, recovered, and so have some of susceptibility. So at the end of the day, every epidemic will end. We just don't know how it will end. It's also important to note that there's something called a social end to epidemic. And this simply means when the public decides they can't deal with it, and they will deal with the consequences. So they can't deal with masks, not seeing their friends, not being able to work. And we saw this in many poor parts of the communities in all countries, where people eventually said, you know, I might as well die, but at the end of the day, I should be out there trying to earn an income for my family. So some of the political aspects I would like to touch on are the following: the non-pharmacological interventions and whether or not they're practical, the impact of race on the outcomes that we're seeing with COVID. The organizers asked me to touch on whether Africa should be used as a vaccine testing site, and controversies regarding that. And of course, corruption and profiteering is foremost in our minds, and power grabs by those in authority. So firstly, I already spoke about the biological basis for the non-pharmacological interventions, or the NPIs, such as physical distancing or social distancing, hand washing, and the wearing of masks. Now, one of the challenges is, of course, some of these things are pretty much can be impractical in some social settings, because how do you socially distance in a slum when everyone lives cheek to jowl? By the way, I opted to use the more politically incorrect term slum, just to relate exactly what we're talking about. How does someone sanitize regularly when they live in an environment where there's no guarantee of running water, and the only water has to be fetched from a muddy lake 2 kilometers away? Or if there's tap water, the tap is shared by 100 households, and sometimes the water runs out. Also, one of the things we noted was people working remotely from home, which is one of the reasons why Zoom has become so familiar to many of us. For instance, the platform I'm using right now. But how do you work from home when your job is a supermarket cashier? Because a supermarket cashier cannot sit at home and ring the groceries for someone while sitting at home. Unfortunately, those people have to travel in public transport to a place of work, sit there for 12 hours, and then travel back in public transport 12 hours later. And surprise, surprise, one of the groups of people which had the highest infections was these frontline workers, like the supermarket cashiers and the delivery persons, individuals who really could not work from home. And if they do not turn up for work, no employer is going to pay them anything. So once again, that simply shows how the impact has been uneven on different sectors of society. I think it's important to note that a crisis like the coronavirus pandemic does not cause any of the flaws or the imperfections in our society. It merely magnifies the flaws that already exist. Because one of the questions is why so many people are forced to live in slums with no access to running water. The issue is not that there's a coronavirus. The issue is, why have people been forced to live in such a society for so many years? And we have simply let it be and ignored it. I use the collective we, but the collective we have simply ignored it and allowed this to be a form of life for many people. Now, there's been a lot of research regarding whether race impacts on outcomes. Statistics from the United Kingdom show that Black, Asian, and Middle Eastern individuals have a 3 to 4 times higher mortality than white patients, even though they make up a minority of the population. In the United States, in one state, in Michigan, they noted that although Black Americans make up only 15% of the population in that state, they accounted for 33% or a third of all the COVID-19 cases and 50% of deaths. Now, there are many reasons why this is so. First of all, there are a lot of health determining socioeconomic variables which are closely linked to ethnicity or race. These include, are you more likely to live in very dense housing or overcrowded settings, as opposed to white citizens who are more likely to have lower population density? There's also issues regarding access to healthcare, which again reflects individuals' differing economic power. But also it should not be forgotten that there is genuine racism even in the medical field, where individuals, Black individuals, for instance, may not get timely escalation of therapy, or they may not get offered higher levels of care, such as intensive care, in comparison to white individuals. So we cannot get away from the fact that race is closely linked to economic factors, and those economic and social factors relate as well to healthcare outcomes. Now, with regards to vaccine testing in Africa, a starting point is that there are close to 200 vaccines which are being tested throughout the world, which is again a big number and quite impressive on one level, considering that 10 months ago, no one was even talking about COVID-19, and yet 10 months later, we're in a position where there are close to 200 vaccine trials. So one of the controversies was whether Africa should be used as a testing ground. My personal opinion, and this is personal opinion, is we should be partners in any vaccine research, simply because to benefit from cutting-edge medical advances, you have to be participating in cutting-edge medical research. So our scientists have to be involved in these research projects. I do emphasize, though, that it has to be with adherence to the highest standards of research ethics. Sadly, in Africa, there's a long legacy of research which has been done under false pretenses or without full disclosure of risks and benefit, in which case European pharmaceutical companies or American pharmaceutical companies have simply taken advantage of African populations and used us as guinea pigs. I will say, where we have our own scientists, and it's worth noting that we have world-class scientists who are able to participate in a lot of this research. If we can use our scientists to participate in some of these trials, then it contributes to a global effort to find a treatment or a vaccine. Because it's worth remembering that this is a global pandemic, and all of us, or the entire globe, has to participate in finding a cure. Allied with this strict adherence to high standards of research ethics has to be that there has to be an understanding that for the price of us participating has to be that we will get some early access to some of the vaccines. So we cannot wait 2 years for manufacturing capacity to ramp up before we get access to the first batches of drugs. Rather, the first batches of drugs have to be equally distributed, particularly if our populations are also participating. But this is one of those matters where we simply need good research ethics to participate, because without good research, we cannot move forward in terms of medical knowledge. Okay, and then I'd also like to talk about the corruption and profiteering, which we've all taken note of. Now, the pandemic, of course, created ideal conditions for those who choose to profiteer off the public purse. Firstly, there was public panic, and panic always leads to one thing. The government is told to do something, whatever the something is, but they will do something. And if something involves the purchase of items or the disbursement of funds, then that's what governments will do, because they want to do something, because the public is crying out for someone to do something. There was, of course, a lot of pressure on health authorities to protect the frontliners, in particular the healthcare workers, but also other frontliners such as retail workers and security service personnel. The supply chains throughout the world were disrupted, which meant that stock was not being delivered, particularly from the world's factory, that is China, and goods could not cross borders easily. Not to mention that there was global competition to a point where even allies and world powers were battling over limited supplies of PPE. There's a story that's been told that was told in the media about how a French hospital flew to China to collect a consignment of PPE, and on the runway before their plane could be loaded, an American investor arrived, decided they would pay double, and simply took the consignment which was initially allocated to the French and flew home with it. In our country, we also had the issue of these emergency procurement policies, which allow the procurement of goods outside of typical supply chain procedures, which of course creates loopholes that allow certain individuals to price gouge the state in many instances. And in our country, we've seen a few high-profile fall guys who are now sitting at home on suspension, with a few of them on pending legal criminal charges. However, this is a small percentage of the likely scale of corruption and profiteering that we've seen. And then we've also seen some kind of power grab from those in authority who've taken advantage of these emergency and disaster legislation, which typically allows them to subvert normal rulemaking procedures and also allows them to limit some rights. Now, unfortunately, a lot of emergency or disaster legislation was drafted to help countries deal with localized disasters. So what happens if there's a flood in KZN? What happens if there's a small earthquake in a small Western Cape town? This is what a lot of disaster legislation was drafted for very localized outbreaks, which are typically very short in duration and very localized. However, now we have the situation where national authorities can declare an entire country to be in a state of emergency or a state of disaster. And what we've seen is the bureaucrats, and in some cases the autocrats, went to town in terms of drafting all sorts of legislation. I think we've still not gotten over the idea that a minister can stand up in front of the media and tell the population which kind of clothing they can wear or buy rather, and which kind of clothing they cannot buy, or to tell us that we can go to the same supermarket to buy a loaf of bread and uncooked chicken, but we cannot buy cooked chicken from the same supermarket that you've already gone to. So these inconsistencies are a result of bureaucrats simply enjoying the power that comes from making rules by fiat. Now, in many cases, citizens agree that there's a need for emergency regulations, but on the whole, they are not popular, particularly when they are inconsistent and do not seem to pass a rationality test. And lastly, we should also remember the securitization of what is essentially a public health response. That means the deployment of the military on our streets to keep people in their homes, to protect them, not from an invading force, but from an invisible virus, as well as all the human rights abuses and even frank murder that occurred as a result of this securitization of what is essentially a public health response. Now, I would like to move on to the last phase, and I think I've gone past time a little bit, but I hope the organizer will bear with me. Now, the organizer wanted me to talk a lot about what the world after COVID-19 will look like. But I think it's too early to say what the world will look like post-COVID. Firstly, we're right in the middle of the storm. We can't even say we're at the end of the first wave. There's no vaccine and there's no cure yet. So it's hard to visualize a world after COVID when we have no idea when COVID will be over. As indicated, a lot of countries are now entering their second waves with similar lockdown strategies that they employed during the first wave. And there's, of course, a worry that they could be third, fourth, and even fifth waves. Now, Iran, for an example, seems to be undergoing what looks like a third wave for them. We must also remember that viruses have a potential to mutate all the time. So something could change in the COVID-19 virus. In other words, it could become less deadly, but it will also become more deadly. It can become more infectious or it can become less infectious. But it's worth remembering that there's a significant potential for this new infection to mutate further to an even more infectious or even deadlier form of itself. And we genuinely need to be ready that we might have to live with the virus for a very long time. Now, the problem is we don't know what life will mean if we have to live with it for a very long time. Now, one of the concerns is, unlike a lot of respiratory infections, having COVID once does not guarantee that an individual will not acquire COVID a second time. There are a handful of individuals who have been clinically documented to have reinfection of COVID-19. Now, the reason COVID-19 seems to reinfect the same person is in common with a lot of other respiratory infections. The antibodies which protect against the infection, they seem to have a short lifespan in the human body, which might be as short as 6 months. So now that becomes a huge concern, because if you get COVID in March, you've recovered, you might be open to the chance of being reinfected in October and going forward. And what this will mean for the world is hard to say, because potentially we could have mini outbreaks in different parts of the country at different times. So what does this mean for wearing of masks? What does this mean for school opening? What does this mean for the reopening of sports? What does this mean for the reopening of leisure? It's very hard to know how society will deal with this. But if you remember when I spoke about the 3 phases of an epidemic, society at one point or another will find its own equilibrium of dealing with the virus. That is simply a natural thing that will happen. We will find our own ways. Whether some of us will segregate ourselves quite strictly or not is hard to say. But in one way or the other, societies and groups within societies will find ways to deal with the uncertainties of this virus. Secondly, the world post-COVID, I think we can expect there will be a lot of investment in epidemiology and surveillance. So the smart authorities will put resources into disease surveillance architecture, as well as facilities for dealing with the next pandemic. As indicated, there will be another pandemic. We don't know if it's next year or 2 years from now or 10 years or 20 years, but without a doubt, there will be another pandemic sometime in the future, because there are too many factors that promote viral mutation, as well as viruses jumping from animal hosts to human beings, as has happened with the 3 SARS coronaviruses. But also, I think we'll have a new generation of young people who are now inspired to study topics like virology, infectious disease, and epidemiology. This is largely because on the news, they've been seeing Prof. Karim, they've been seeing Prof. Fauci from the UK, and they've been engaging in the science as it appears in the media. And so we can expect that there will be a new generation that will choose the infectious disease sphere as a route for study and future occupation. We'll also be able to develop new blueprints for dealing with natural emergencies. Now, first of all, a lot of countries are going to have to dust off their disaster regulations and look at how they impeded things, but also how they helped the effort in fighting against this coronavirus. There's, of course, a risk of regulations which are more authoritarian in their emphasis, such as regulations which give executive authorities significant powers over people's rights of movement and rights to freedom of expression. As you can note, our South African disaster regulations specifically criminalized the dissemination of what is called fake news. But apart from the risk of a rise in authoritarianism, there's also the opportunity for some drafters to draft more sensible laws and regulations. And to go back to the previous example, hopefully in future, no minister or a minister's aide who set up typing that memo will sit on a computer and type a memo that says you cannot have chicken in a restaurant. You cannot buy chicken from Pick and Pay, but you can buy an uncooked chicken from the same restaurant. It is not sensible, and hopefully people will reflect on this in planning for the next disaster. Across the world, we've also seen multiple case studies in different settings which show what works and what doesn't. In many ways, people have said the global experience of COVID-19 has probably been the largest experiment in human history. Amongst other things, we've had to experiment what happens to an entire society if you lock down the whole society. And we've clearly seen some of the cost of that, including the psychological impact on many people when they're forced to self-isolate. And we've also seen that a lot of economies just cannot run remotely or virtually. Economies need footfall. They need people going into restaurants, people going into stadiums for economies to run. There really is no virtual economy around the world. And we can look at multiple countries, countries that did all the right things like Taiwan, countries that took a completely different path like Sweden and the like, and everyone in between. And we can hopefully learn from that for the next pandemic. Also, what we're likely to have going forward, and this touches in with the fact that we don't know yet how this is going to end, is we're probably going to still have a world of haves and have-nots. The haves are those who are probably going to get early access to the vaccine or the cure because they can pay a lot for it. And this includes some of the Western countries which have essentially made huge gambles by buying the first 1 million doses from different vaccine manufacturers without a guarantee that the vaccine will work or will even be available. Countries like the United Kingdom and the United States have pre-booked, in many cases, the first 1 million or 10 million doses from some of the pharmaceutical companies that are conducting these trials. And we can easily envision a scenario where if the vaccine is available next year, these countries get quick access to it for most of their population, and they're able to return to a semblance of normality very quickly. We also know that the haves, and this has been reflected quite clearly in this crisis, the haves typically work in white-collar jobs. So typically they work in an office behind a laptop, and it hasn't been a big stretch or a big adjustment for a lot of them to work remotely, which is just a fancy way of saying they can now work from home. The have-nots, in contrast, typically work blue-collar jobs and cannot work remotely. I'm sure you've noticed it's the low-skilled cashier at the supermarket cannot work remotely. The refuse collector cannot work remotely. The mine worker cannot work remotely. And these people are therefore forced to put up with the definite risk of picking up COVID-19, whilst the employers and the executives can sit at home and in their study, they can work off a laptop. With regards to the vaccine, we know that the have-nots will be at the back of the queue and their lives will of course remain disrupted for a very long time because there's speculation that even if a vaccine is available, it will take 2 to 5 years for it to get around the world. Because for a start, manufacturers have to ramp up their manufacturing capacity, then the vaccine has to be distributed to all parts of the globe. Then the vaccine actually has to be administered to different people. Now, we're talking about 7.5 billion people on the planet. And anyone who works in logistics will tell you that is not an easy thing to deliver something to 7 billion people. And then finally, there will probably be some kind of political realignment post COVID-19. Now, the most immediate is in countries with very fluid governances where the seat of government can change very easily based on one scandal or the like. Political leaders who are deemed to have handled the pandemic well will be rewarded at the ballot box. And a good example is Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who just won a relative landslide just this past weekend on the back of her handling of the COVID crisis in New Zealand. And in contrast, those who are deemed to have dropped the ball will probably be punished at the ballot box. And there's good reason to believe that Donald Trump will be voted out in November, largely due to his mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's of course speculation that the crisis could sow the seeds of revolt in those who feel left behind, those who feel that they were not given access to treatment or access to food parcels, and those of course who will lose their jobs, because one of the things to keep in mind is a lot of people will lose their jobs, lose their security of income, and in some places this could obviously create unstable conditions which could lead to some kind of revolt amongst those populations. So all these are merely speculations. I'm sure you are all aware I'm not a political scientist or an economic scientist, but these are merely some speculations from me regarding what we will see post-COVID. So thank you, and I'll hand over to the host, Simpiwe.
Thank you, Dr. Phetho Mangena. That was very informative and insightful, and I'm sure a lot of people who have been listening benefited a lot out of your presentation, and it was great. And I did deliberately allow you to, continue beyond the time that we had discussed because of the informative nature of your insightful presentation. Thank you very much. Just a couple of issues and questions that have arisen as you were talking. I'm sure some of them you have alluded to and responded to. How far are we from, from the vaccine in terms of your research and analysis and understanding?
So the simple answer is no one knows.
No one knows.
No one knows. So if we look at typical vaccine development, it takes up to 10 years to develop a vaccine. Now that's the trend up to so far. I know some people were very optimistic and speaking about a vaccine before the end of the year, but that was unrealistic and wishful thinking for many of them. Because it's also difficult to predict when you'll reach something you've never done before. No one has ever produced a virus against the corona or any of the coronaviruses. We're talking even the first SARS virus in 2013, the Middle East variant, no one has been successful in producing a vaccine. In many instances, people thought, where can we cut corners to get to the end point quicker than before? And there's been a huge global effort to do that, to try and shrink that 10-year timeline to 18 months. Now that's a huge undertaking. How do you shrink 10 years into 18 months? So in simple terms, I know there are people who will, maybe they don't want to panic the public. They'll say, we think it's 18 months away. We think it's before the end of 2020, but no one knows. Because it's one thing to do a trial, but will it show you the results that you want? So I'm not hopeful it will arrive this year. We might have some early indication next year, because what will happen next year is the major trials would have been running for at least 6 months. So we'll at least know which ones look like they work and which ones look like they're safe. And then we can take it from there. But in reality, everyone is just thumb sucking. Anyone who says they know when a vaccine is coming from is sucking out of their thumbs.
Now tell me, why is it that this SARS-CoV-2 is more prominent than MERS, which seem to have a much higher mortality rate, and it's been there, for a longer time. MERS came in, you said, about 2013 or so, which means we have been living with it for 7 years now. What are the lessons that have been learned from the study of the Middle East respiratory syndrome, and to what extent does it correlate with what we see with this SARS-CoV-2? Are there any strong similarities just in terms of how they present themselves and how they get attended to and treated?
Well, because the three viruses, that is the first SARS coronavirus, Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus, and our current foe, the SARS-CoV-2, because they come from the same family, there's some similarity in their clinical features, including this potential for a chronic illness. That has also been documented in both MERS and the initial SARS outbreak. We don't fully know. You would have noticed I shared some slides which were courtesy of Dr. Mutambi, who's a colleague who works in virology. And she was saying we don't fully understand why MERS, for whatever reason, seemed to burn out, for lack of a better word. The disease seemed to spring up in Saudi Arabia, start spreading mainly within the Middle East. There were a few cases which were exported to Europe and the US. I'm not aware of a South African case. So there are a few cases which spread, but it was very limited in time and place. So something very unusual was happening with MERS. MERS also had a much higher mortality rate of 35%. Now, if COVID had this high mortality rate, we really would be in a bad situation. Yeah.
That's quite interesting. And the other question, I mean, you've been leading the the fight against the pandemic in the Limpopo province, and if you look at just the character of the province itself is very similar to KZN and Eastern Cape, and you have seen very little infection rate or deaths in Limpopo compared to those two provinces. What is it that you were doing different to what has been seen happening in those other provinces that are very similar in character and nature? I mean, if you consider the issue of lack of water, the nature of the province, and just the levels of inequality in all of those provinces are quite similar. Yet the infection rate and most probably the response to the pandemic has been somewhat different, or has it?
Well, I think the infection rate and the mortality has definitely been lower in the northern and the rural provinces. Now, the northern and rural provinces, I mean Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and Northwest. In contrast to Eastern Cape, would also be typically classed as a rural province, but they had a terrible epidemic. I think a lot of the reasons are probably environmental, like the climate probably played a big role. And then potentially the spread of infection, because the Western Cape was such a hotspot, there are very close links between individuals in the Western Cape and Eastern Cape. So the Eastern Cape was probably importing a lot of their cases from the Western Cape, which is one of the reasons why they had such a poor run in terms of their caseload as well as the mortality. It's also worth mentioning that healthcare services in different provinces are not always up to scratch. Those from the Eastern Cape were clearly highlighted in the media as having quite severe problems. I think some of you may have seen some of the pictures from Livingston of, filth, for lack of a better word, on the floors and everywhere, and dirty material. So on the one hand, they had huge challenges in their healthcare sector, that is the Eastern Cape, and they had a reservoir that was coming through from the Western Cape. But I think we should not get away from the fact that it wasn't necessary. I don't think it was entirely the response of the healthcare system, because insider view is the Limpopo healthcare system is also very poor. I'll be honest, and I keep thinking we got away lightly, and I think something kept the infection rate low. What is that something? We're down to speculation that it was the weather conditions. We also know that, for instance, Limpopo and Northwest have some of the youngest populations in South Africa. So if you look at the age distribution of different provinces, then Limpopo itself has the lowest average age or median age amongst all the 9 provinces. So that would have been a factor. Then you have to look at housing. Interesting enough, Limpopo has the lowest proportion of people in informal settlements. It doesn't always look that way if you drive through some parts of Polokwane, but we actually have the lowest proportion of people living in informal settlements. So I think a little bit of all of that contributed to the overall, to us missing the bullet by a wide margin.
And indeed, you did miss the bullet by a wide margin. I mean, if you look at where we stand now, I think the last I checked, we're standing at something like 18,000 deaths. And if you walk around, the big townships, Phetho, KwaZulu, and other, townships in the country, life has always been life. It's business as usual. The aspects of prevention that you had mentioned before, I doubt very much that they had been observed, social distancing, and you did list it as impracticalities. And I do want to hear what has been really practical and that has been seen to work, more especially in the communities of Black people where, there's a lot of, population of people who would have been infected by this and probably couldn't get the treatment that they were hoping to. And further to that, you did mention the possibility of the haves having access to medical treatment much easier and much faster compared to those who do not have. I mean, does really it play a role, money, when it comes to a pandemic where all health facilities are just oversubscribed, and if you go to any private or public hospital, just access becomes impossible, irrespective of how much money you have. The other aspect that I would want you to comment on is I think just the nature of us as Black people, of believing in our own knowledge systems. We tend to look for our own medication, our own ways of resolving our own ailments. Don't you think that has had any bearing or factor in how the majority of our people responded to to this pandemic?
Okay, so let's talk about the practicality of the non-pharmacological interventions, the hand washing and the wearing of masks and the social distancing. Now, I think we rightly agree that it doesn't seem practical for someone to do if they stay in an informal settlement with no access to running water. I think there's no substitute for it. Now, these non-pharmacological interventions are effective when they are used properly, and they're cheap, right? Apart from you need a state actor to provide water to people. They're clearly very effective and very cheap. So I think once again it comes down to this pandemic was probably never going to be that severe in our setting, because if those things were the only defense we had, then right now we'd be talking about a death toll in the hundreds of thousands. But the fact that it didn't meant that even without those interventions, the coronavirus was not as bad as feared. I think we must still put it into context, right? That there's still been a lot of deaths due to COVID. I'm not talking close to 20,000 deaths in our country. It's significant. I did say that I did say TB kills about 40,000 people per year. So this is about half what TB kills in 10 months, as opposed to over 12 months. So yes, it's not a huge number, but it's still 20,000 lives. So we should still keep that in mind. So I think the fact that we did not reach the apocalypse doesn't mean it's been painless. It has been full of pain for many people, and the pain will still come because economic pain always leads to poor health outcomes. So all the economic difficulties they're speaking about will reflect themselves in health next year, 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, and so on. So I think let's not pat ourselves on the back too much. But I do think something within the population or the environment meant the disease was nowhere near as severe as was projected. So we should keep that in mind. With regards to money, does money buy you better outcomes? Well, in general, yes. It can buy you a bed in an ICU if the one at the public hospital is full. Now, one of the things that worried me in the last few months was I felt that the ICU rollout was very slow in our province. And there have been a couple of incidences I remember where I had no more ICU beds left, but I had people who needed to go to ICU. And unfortunately, those people are not with us. Now, I've not heard of private being completely saturated. They had a high workload and caseload, but I've not heard of any significant private hospital being completely overloaded to a point where they had to turn away patients due to COVID. So unfortunately, money does buy you access to, in some cases, better healthcare. Because remember, most of the population were dependent on the government to produce the so-called 20,000 ICU beds that we're supposed to get. It would be interesting to audit that and see how many of the 20,000 were actually ready and when were they ready. Because I think the findings will be discouraging, to say the least. And then with regards to indigenous knowledge systems, they clearly have potential. And one country in the world which fully appreciates their indigenous knowledge are the Chinese. They have universities for indigenous medical knowledge, and close links between what happens in the indigenous knowledge field and modern biotechnology, to a point where one of the most recently discovered malarial drugs was known for thousands of years in China. It's called Artemether. They've been using it for thousands of years to cure malaria, and all they needed to do was to link the people who know indigenous knowledge with a good biotechnology group. They isolate the active ingredient, then they do proper clinical trials, and now the medication is registered for use around the world to treat malaria. And no one talks about funny Chinese medication for malaria. So there's potential to make use of indigenous knowledge systems. I do come from the bias of a different kind of medicine or science, but there's no reason the two can't work together to use each other's assets or each other's attributes for the greater good. So there is role for that. some of you will remember there was the whole Madagascar.
Yeah.
That concoction they came up with, which unfortunately was in the end not to work. But nonetheless, the potential is there for us to harness our indigenous knowledge, as long as it's done in a non-exploitative manner, and it has to be proactively promoted by ourselves. I don't know how many people have heard the story of, I'm not sure if it's the correct one, of buhu. Now, buhu was a substance that the indigenous San people, because when they go hunting, they typically go hunting for days on end with no access to food. So they would take buhu. I'm not sure if it's buhu. I might be mistaken. Maybe if someone else knows, they can correct me. But there was a herb they used to suppress the appetite to allow them to go on this 3-day hunt with no access to food. An American pharmaceutical company heard about this. They isolated the active ingredient, and now they market it as a weight loss drug. And the San people benefit nothing from this drug. So there's a cautionary tale in that. Until we respect our own indigenous knowledge and I don't want to say contemporize it, but we make it work for us where we are. We make it work for us because we are still the same people.
Yeah.
Us where we are. Someone else will swoop in one day and say,
I just think that we need to appreciate it and see it as one of the solutions within the basket that we can tap from. And not discard it as some kind of inferior, and yet a lot of people have lived healthily as a result of what they know better to have worked for them. And I just want to as we move towards closing the discussion, check with you as you were dealing with this. Has the lockdowns have they worked for our country? Because largely, when we were sent to lockdown 5, 4, and 3, it was to prepare the country for dealing with the pandemic, ensuring that health facilities are in place, and these places where you quarantine, or the quarantine sites are in place, and so forth, and so on. Has all of these worked to benefit the health system of the country? If we are to be confronted with another wave, which we are likely to go into maybe next winter, are we in a state where we can say we are ready for this pandemic? And maybe linked to that, wouldn't you say that this pandemic was some kind of a silver lining for a country to attend to its own issues of inequality and poverty, taking account of lack of water, lack of resources, and the issues of densification that we were talking about? What is your view in all of these aspects?
Okay. So the first question relates to lockdowns, whether they work or not. So I think there are two things I said during the course of the presentation. The first is the unprecedented nature of lockdowns across most of the world at roughly the same time. I think at one point there was data saying that 60% of the population at this particular time
is in lockdown.
Under lockdown, different countries and settings. So that's the greatest experiment in human history. So we've had 10 months to figure out whether lockdowns work or not. Now, one of the things we discovered with our lockdown, and I think that people still need to crunch the data properly and present it, is cases were increasing dramatically, even at the most stringent levels of lockdown. So in other words,
you did say that.
The huge multiplication where the cases doubled every week or something was actually happening during level 5 when the tightest restrictions were in place. So that's a little bit counterintuitive. And I think the reason for that is relates to what I said, the power grab by those who have an autocratic bent to them.
Yeah.
Lockdowns give you a lot of power. You can tell people in only the Eastern Cape that you are not allowed out of your house between 10 p.m. at night and 6 a.m. the next morning. And you can't even challenge that in court. I think that was one of the lessons from the various court cases, is there's almost no recourse to challenge those laws. I also think some of it may have been scientific illiteracy from the people in charge, in that either they or they didn't
despite the advisory committees that were there.
Either they didn't want to hear, or they missed the part where people said lockdowns can only ever be temporary. Lockdowns buy time, but that time itself is limited, because the longer the lockdown persists, first of all, you have new problems, right? There are other people who can't get to hospitals. Your economy grinds to a halt, and there are consequences to that. So I think that was the problem, is there was an over-reliance on the idea that if you lock down South Africans, and if these disobedient people just follow the rules, will be fine in 2 weeks. The truth is we were probably past that phase a long time ago. Because like I said, the country with the best response was Taiwan. Why? Because Taiwan, as soon as they knew there was a viral cluster they mobilized everything that's needed to deal with this kind of infection. Now it helps that they've dealt with SARS just 7 years ago, but they mobilized everything. So they knew when people come in, I think if you didn't have a cell phone, you were getting a cell phone so that the authorities can check you twice a day. What's your temperature, Mr. Hashin? Are you still coughing? If you need to go to hospital, they'll take you to hospital. Some people were being fitted with electronic tags to be sure that they don't move. Now, the thing is, those measures only work early on, when you've got 10 cases in the country, when you've got maybe cases in the country. Once you start going beyond 50, beyond 100, then the horse has bolted. You can still lock down, because lockdown might prevent the caseload. If you remember, the initial caseload in Gauteng was Sandton, might prevent the caseload from spreading to the rest of Gauteng and then to the neighboring provinces like Limpopo and Mpumalanga. It might help. But by the time our lockdown started, we had long passed that step. And I think this is the scientific illiteracy part. They kept thinking if you keep hammering it, the lockdown, something will change. And unfortunately, the case is increasing just as rapidly. And not to knock the lockdown too much, because it certainly did slow things down, at least in the first month. So when they model what the curve looks like at the beginning, and what it looked like in reality, there was a definite separation of the curves. So the initial lockdown worked somewhat, but at some point the lockdown was not enough. At some point, the infection had spread to too many provinces, too many different social strata, that another lockdown, another week, was really not doing anything. So it's worth remembering, lockdowns work if they're short and sharp, and the lockdowns only buy time. They don't effectively stop an infection, they just buy time.
Very true. And in a country that's got 40% unemployment rate, it tells a story that it just buys time, especially for those of you who are clinicians. We need to prepare for this kind of thing, and also for those who are handling the economic muscle of the country. So as to how then they should be responding to the pandemic. Otherwise, for the majority of the people, it matters not, because it doesn't change their dynamic in any way in terms of how they continue to live their lives.
I think to the second part of your question, you asked me if this has been a silver lining.
Yeah. I did ask about the silver lining, whether because you see,
I don't think
my thinking is that in any situation there's always a silver lining, and I'm just checking with you. What is the silver lining with this pandemic? Is it giving us an opportunity to fast track some of the interventions that needed to have been deployed so many years ago in terms of addressing issues of poverty and inequality? Well,
I think it's shown the spotlight again on why do so many people live without access to clean running water? Why do so many people in shacks? And as I said, there's also a collective sense that we must all acknowledge as citizens, we live in that country. One way or the other, we let it happen. Whether that is our voting choices or what, but one way or the other, the populace lets it happen. So there's a collective sense that we must take responsibility for that. Will it be a silver lining? I fear not. And the reason is, in the early days, that is where a lot of the media attention was, right? Was, look at Alexandra. How are these people gonna socially distance? There's no water in this place. And unfortunately, the media cycle means later they moved on to something else. I think we spent 2 months talking about PPE. If you look carefully, it's died down because a few sacrificial lambs have been thrown out to the media and to the hawks.
Indeed.
So if you look at today's paper, they're not talking a lot about this whole PPE drama.
Not anymore.
Possibly 2 billion worth of fraudulent expenditure, potentially more. So it's died down. So that is really the crisis, which is why it's the population that has to decide what they want after COVID. Voting choices is a start, but how we hold those in power to account is important as well. So there are a few things which will improve. I think that the NHLS is getting a bigger budget. We might, but now that we've got such an extreme financial hit from the lockdown and everything, it's going to make it difficult to actually move forward with any of those plans. So, because anyone can come up with great plans, let's improve water reticulation and whatnot, but now there's no money. If ever there was no money, now there is even less no money. So the situation is even more dire. But again, this is something for us as citizens to say what are the priorities are and to move that country in that direction, and to punish those in power if they don't do that. It's a pity that governments here don't always change, even on the back of scandal after scandal after scandal. That example that I gave, that the New Zealanders gave their prime minister a landslide because she handled it so well. Yes. On the other hand, Trump is probably going to lose because he did so terribly in terms of COVID, despite everything else which disqualifies him for public office. It's just his handling of the COVID which resonates with people. So it will be interesting whether our people see this as an opportunity to make their voice heard, that they felt exploited, they felt thrown to the wolves and the like.
No, thank you very much. And I think what is clear that the future is in our hands as to how we decide to move forward. It's really up to us, and whether we accept or not accept the decisions of those wielding power at the present moment is really up to us. So in essence, we're still in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and we still continue to live with it. As to how we proceed to live with it is really up to us. Your concluding remarks?
In conclusion, look, I think this virus is going to be with us for a long time. So we actually should start planning for how we live with it. There will be a parallel scientific effort, which is the vaccine and cure. And I think we'll slowly make progress on a scientific front, but it will be realistic progress where it will take us 12 to 24 months to develop the next drug in the armamentarium. So we'll have to live with it for a long time. But as a society, it's how we deal with it going forward. Now we need to start honestly talking about what's going to happen to schooling, because yes, if you open schools, well, fortunately they're open. I mean, children are not going to school properly. There's no student who learns 2 days a week or 1 day a week in some cases. That's people might as well not be in school. So we need to have proper discussions with the science, but also with understanding things from a humanist point of view. How do we get this country going in some form or the other post-COVID? Or during COVID, because I don't know yet when post-COVID is. So all I see on the horizon is during COVID, not post-COVID. I don't see post-COVID yet. I'm hoping I'll be surprised one day I'll wake up and there's something, but in the meantime, society needs to get on. Getting on does not mean throwing caution to the wind. There's still things we can do. As an example, I'm careful about visiting my parents because they're older and I've just come out of a COVID ward, for instance. So that's me protecting my parents. So there are ways we need to all adapt to what's happening, but at the same time, society needs to get going one way or the other. And yes, let's not lose sight of what's been highlighted, all the flaws in our society. We've known about them, but this is a chance to double down, to re-emphasize them, that it's not right for a little girl to grow up in a house that has no water. It really is not. And we cannot be okay with it when we're okay with bidding for the next Olympics or something. So for me, the thing is, let's keep protecting each other during COVID. Let's find ways which are sensible and realistic to carry on with life, because life is going on. We just have to be sensible about it.
Dr. Phetho Mangena, thank you very much for spending the afternoon with us. It was always great having this conversation, and I'm sure, as you can see, we can continue until late in the afternoon if we were to interact further than this. And I think it's been great, and I know that people have been appreciating of your views and comments on it. And until next time, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the invitation and giving me the time.
Thank you. That was it. We'll see each other tomorrow when we get October 19th.
Ooh, yeah. Listen, the struggle was not red. I experienced it, being deprived, being oppressed, being confused. It's enough now, we're taking the power back. We're stronger than before, we're proud, too strong. The world